Я уверен, что Россию мир слушает.
I am sure that the world is listening to Russia. It's hard for me to say how much they hear us. I think the majority understands what it is about, but they are forced to obey the most cruel dictate. Of course, it is very bad when people die. Military personnel, and, furthermore, civilians, women, children, as it was in the Donbass. And as it is also happening now during our special military operation, which is designed to put an end to any war that could take place on Ukrainian territory and stem from the Ukrainian territory. A solution will be found, I have no doubt. The conditions, that are minimal for us, are well known. They are discussed, including negotiations with the Ukrainian side. This is not just the situation in Ukraine, not just the task of demilitarizing and denazifying this country, as well as preventing manifestations of genocide and cessation of any violence on its territory and ensuring that Ukrainians determine their own destiny. We are talking about the world order, and it is no coincidence that the West is avoiding reacting to our clear, precise proposals regarding the security architecture in Europe. Strengthening the security of the West at the expense of the security of Russia has already become the talk of the town. They tell us, don't worry, the inclusion of Ukraine or another country will not pose a threat to Russia's security. But why should the West determine for us what is needed for our security? They listen to us, but they don't hear us, and they try to impose their understanding of how to continue to live in Europe. I'm sure this hysteria will pass. Our Western partners will soon come to their senses. We are ready for dialogue on one indispensable condition, exclusively on the basis of equality and on the basis of taking into account each other's interests.
Europe
and the United States are trying to close any media, any sources of information from Russia, which tells what is happening in Ukraine, how the special military operation is developing, and how the Ukrainian army, especially the neo-Nazi Ukrainian battalions, behave toward civilians. When they retreat, they simply rob settlements. Ukrainians are now trying to use citizens as human shields. Talk to Indians, Arabs, Africans who are now trying to leave Ukraine. They are not allowed. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister of India spoke with the President of Russia. He is concerned that one Indian citizen, a student, died in Ukraine, in Kharkiv. There are no Russian troops in Kharkiv, but we see a situation at the Kharkiv railway station, where foreigners who want to leave are not allowed to do it. But they are ready to flee even through Russia. And we are ready to accept these students. I think that Zelensky is being manipulated by Nazis and neo-Nazis. Otherwise, it is very difficult for me to explain how he can preside in a society where neo-Nazis flourish. They march, conduct exercises, learn methods of war in the city, methods of sabotage, provocation. All this happens under President Zelensky. And when he claims that his grandfather fought in the Great Patriotic War, look at the laws he signs. How can a president who is a man of the world, as any Jew should be, sign a law on the indigenous peoples of Ukraine? And among the indigenous peoples there are no Russian people. How can a president who is not a racist, forbid supporting the Russian language not only in schools, but also in everyday life? And in Russia, in Crimea, there are 3 official languages, which never happened under the Ukrainian government. Russian, Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian. And any Russian citizen living in Crimea has every right to apply to any government office in their own language. And he is obliged to answer in the language in which he addresses. Any human life is priceless. Any hostilities are associated, unfortunately, with casualties. Not only among military personnel, but also among civilians. Our military personnel who are participating in a special operation have a strict order to use high-precision weapons to suppress the military structure. Even the barracks where the Ukrainian soldiers are located are not subject to any attack. I do not condone any action that results in civilian deaths. But we did not come up with the expression collateral damage. Our Western colleagues came up with it during their adventures in Iraq and other countries. I want you to remember how you behaved for 8 years, when girls, women, old people were killed by the thousands in Donbass, killed by the Ukrainian regime. The threat came right to our border. We have evidence that the Pentagon is very concerned about the fate of chemical and biological facilities in Ukraine. Because the Pentagon in Ukraine built 2 biological military laboratories and was engaged in the development of pathogens there. Now they are worried that they will lose control of these laboratories. Military bases were built in Ukraine, by the British in particular. And many other things happened when the Central Intelligence Agency was there, preparing the Ukrainian army, training, obviously not in order to fight Poland. The same Iraq, when the US announced that it was a threat to their national security. Someone asked the question, why on earth did the United States decide to restore order over 10,000 kilometers? And when Russia says, here it is, a threat to us, they explain to us, there is no threat, you are safe. We ourselves will determine the conditions that are necessary for our security when the threat is close to the Russian borders. We do not climb over 10,000 kilometers to restore order according to some of our own rules. We are ready for negotiations. And when President Zelensky asked, President Putin agreed, sent a delegation. Then President Zelensky changed his mind. The Americans probably told him not to rush. Then they said, no, we will come. They arrived not on the day when they agreed, but a day later. We were waiting for them. Negotiations took place. We are ready to talk, but we will continue the operation. Because we cannot afford to keep a structure in Ukraine that threatens the security of the Russian Federation. And in this sense, demilitarization will be brought to an end. We do not start talking about nuclear war. French Foreign Minister Le Drian starts these conversations, urging Russia to remember that it also has nuclear weapons. And Zelensky spoke about this. And Stoltenberg said that, if necessary, we would deploy weapons even closer to Russia. Mrs. Truss from London said she was ready for a war between NATO and Russia. These are the conversations that you are trying to use to accuse us of this as well. But we do not raise the topic of nuclear war and the topic of world war in these discussions. It is needed to continue Russophobia to the point that any Russian is now being subjected to aggression. I hope that our main partners will now go berserk, and we will be ready to talk, but only in a businesslike, pragmatic way, on the basis of equality. If someone expects that the world will be different, and Russia will sit under the bench and submit to dictate, then we must remember our history. We have never concluded any agreements under dictate. We are ready to work in all areas where there is a willingness to conduct business on the basis of a balance of interests. Those countries that banned their companies from working in Russia did so under pressure. They are now saying that we must suffer, if only to teach Russia a lesson. Today I read that the US does not want to allow a rapid rise in oil prices, because it will be beneficial for Russia. That is, not because gasoline will be expensive, and the American voter will pay an increased price and thereby experience a negative attitude towards the authorities, but because it will be beneficial to Russia. Their brains are sharpened for only one thing, to punish Russia in the maximum way. A professor at the University of Chicago wrote 7.5 years ago, after the events in Crimea and southeast Ukraine, the West is leading Ukraine through false hopes, and as a result, Ukraine will collapse. I am in favor of giving Ukraine a neutral status and boosting its economy. Get out from under two fires, where Russia and NATO are the best option for Ukrainians. But instead we tell Ukraine to be against Russia. We play with Ukraine, with the idea that it will become part of the West, and we will defeat Putin. And it plays this game. If they do, it will end badly for them. We are now engaged in provoking such an outcome. It is in the US interest to end the crisis. It is also in the interests of Russia. And most of all, it is in the interests of Ukraine. 7.5 years ago,